Welcome to Praxis. I'm Olivia Rousset. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney, as well as those watching on APAC, online or listening on the radio. Today we'll be discussing development in the private sector. On our panel we have Eugene Zhukov from the Asian Development Bank, Gavin Murray from the International Finance Corporation, and David Shearer from the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. Pacific Island states face a number of challenges when it comes to private sector development. Their disparate and relatively small populations mean that the cost of providing infrastructure and public services are greater. These unique challenges and the future of the private sector and development in the Pacific will be the focus of our discussion today.
Basically, there are three elements that are required for effective private sector development. They are access to markets or market creation. The second is entrepreneurial spirit, and the third is the enabling environment within the economy or the country. And I think in the Pacific what we have is the market is really the deficient element. We do have the entrepreneurial spirit, we've been working on the enabling environment, but it's really that access to market and the scale that really is inhibiting the private sector.
But there's such a limitation and challenge in linking to those markets, whether it be Australia and New Zealand, whether it be further afield, or even more importantly now in the Pacific is those regional markets that we can start to interact with and producers can start to interact with.
I think in many of the countries in the Pacific, infrastructure is a big issue. Because for people to get to the market, they need information, they also need the means to get to the market. And quite often it's either absent or very deficient.
To really address the opportunity for the private sector in the Pacific, we have to look at it in a very different way. And I think the opportunity is at the very small business end, even what we would call the micro end in terms of what we see.
And we think that innovations and new changes in technology that have been happening in the last few years are helping us to address this issue. I'll mention a few things. One is the introduction of mobile telephony, which contributed quite significantly to economic development in the Pacific. For example, as former treasurer of Papua New Guinea mentioned in one of his recent speech, introduction of mobile technology in Papua New Guinea actually contributed 2% of growth to the GNI, gross national income.
I spent a couple of years in the Solomon Islands, and in the time that I was in the Solomon Islands in Honiara, you saw real private sector development. And you just saw around you a whole bunch of businesses springing up in Honiara. But what was really driving that was not the normal drivers of development. It was growth in government spending, and it was growth in donor spending, combined with a booming logging sector as well. And I think that's a really fascinating model because it says that there's different ways of achieving, improvements in living standards, improvements in incomes that we might need to be thinking about in the Pacific.
Fast economic growth because of the expansion of aid provided an important role during difficult time which the country was facing at that particular period. But I personally think if we're talking about long-term development, the sustainable model should rely more on the private sector. As I mentioned earlier, try to overcome the difficulty, the basic difficulty, which is remoteness of the Pacific and the smallness of the market by engaging with innovative technologies and bringing these markets closer to the larger economies and promoting regional integration.
And quick as a flash, he pulled out his mobile phone and he says, oh, well, my friend lives in Lombok and I have another friend in Bali, which is another point in the supply chain, and I just ring both of them when the trader comes. So it's just an insight in terms of where technology that we're establishing or microfinance systems play a really important role in that connectivity to market that we talked about earlier.
So if you're trying to bring the private sector in, for instance, into, say, the power sector or the port sector or water or waste, these are all areas where, in other parts of the world, the private sector has a very efficient and it works very well bringing the private sector into this. It's been much more difficult to achieve in the Pacific because, on the one hand, you have to have an environment that's attractive to the private sector, but on the counterpart of that is you've got to have people that can control it because the motivation, of course, is quite different.
Simplifying laws and regulations and also providing education to people on how to use these new laws and regulation is very important. It is something which we're focusing on.
At the end of the day, the private sector isn't going to be necessarily the dominant engine of GDP and growth. We look at it in perhaps traditional terms of saying, well, where's the trade? Why aren't we promoting more trade? But I think we still need to look at that in a different way.
If we talk about Papua New Guinea, we can see a potential for private sector development to play a very major role and relatively fast in economic growth and development. But when we talk about smaller countries, it becomes a bit of a challenge, and it's to see how the private sector can contribute to economic growth in a very substantive way, very fast. And we think that we need to be different and innovative if we're to solve this riddle.
I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our panellists. And I hope you can join us in a month's time for the next Praxis. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast of Praxis or watch online, you can go to worldbank.org/Praxis. Thank you.